Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive into power dynamics. You know, how state power and corporate influence and the stories the media tells, how it all kind of weaves together. We're going through this really fascinating lecture script. And it uses all these historical examples and some more current case studies too. It's really making me think, are we seeing genuine rifts between, say, Silicon Valley and the old school media giants? Or is it all just part of a show?
It's funny you should say that because this lecture script kicks off with this almost like a contradiction. It says that even the folks at the very top, even with all that power, they often feel like they're under attack constantly.
Yeah, that's not what you'd expect, right? You'd think someone like Rupert Murdoch with his massive media empire, he'd be feeling pretty untouchable.
Exactly. But the script points out that people like Murdoch, they're actually super worried about these platform monopolies,
Yeah.
like Google and Meta. He seems to truly believe that these tech companies are the ones calling the shots now.
And it's not just him either. The script also talks about Eric Schmidt, the former Google CEO. And get this, he actually thinks consumers have the real power. There's this quote from him where he says, competition is just a click away. It's almost like he's downplaying Google's own massive influence.
That reminds me of the work of this sociologist, C. Wright Mills. He had this idea of the power elite. Have you ever heard of that?
Oh, yeah. It's that idea that there's this small group,
Yep.
they're all connected, and they're the ones who really control things.
Exactly.
And it doesn't matter if they have little disagreements among themselves.
Right.
They still hold all the power. Do you think that's true?
Absolutely. And the script goes even deeper with this thing they call the greater good fallacy. Basically, it's this thing where powerful people convince themselves that what they're doing is for the best, even if it leads to terrible outcomes.
Yeah. The examples in the script are pretty scary. Hitler, thinking he was on this righteous mission, even with the Holocaust happening. And Tony Blair, totally convinced about the Iraq War, even with all those civilian deaths. It's wild how people can twist things to make themselves feel better about doing awful stuff.
And it's not just these big historical events. The script says this greater good idea even applies to stuff like Trump's business dealings or all the scandals around Hunter Biden.
So no matter what they do, even if it's shady, they can just tell themselves they're doing it for some higher purpose.
Exactly.
It's kind of messed up. But then the script throws in this other idea, almost the opposite of what we were just talking about. It says that all these fights we see, like Silicon Valley versus the old media companies, that it actually means there isn't one big power structure controlling everything.
Yeah, thinkers like Daniel Bell, they say corporations, for example, they might agree on things like taxes, but mostly they're just looking out for their own interests, which often clash.
Right. And then there's this concept of the vital arena of acceptable controversy. It's by Michael Schudson. And he says that, sure, there are limits to what you can debate,
Yeah.
but the arguments that happen within those limits, they're real, not just for show.
A good example of that is the whole Iraq War debate in the UK. There were huge protests. Even some media outlets owned by Murdoch were against it, and Blair's government went head-to-head with the BBC.
Wow. So even within this, system of power, there are these moments where it looks like things are breaking down.
Yeah.
But then the question becomes, are those moments the norm? Or are they just exceptions that make the rules seem more real? Maybe we're getting distracted by these little fights while the real power brokers are just doing their thing behind the scenes.
That's the challenge, right?
Mhm.
Can you see the bigger picture? It's like those magic eye posters. You have
Yeah.
to look at it just right to see what's really there.
Okay, so now the script takes us through this really fascinating journey through history. It's all about how power dynamics have shifted over time. And a lot of it's driven by technology. It starts with trucking versus airlines, then newspapers against radio and television, and now it's the old media versus those tech platforms we were talking about earlier.
And to show how this works, the script uses this really captivating case study, the Guardian newspaper,
Yeah.
and how the relationship with different power centers has evolved.
Right. So in the beginning, they were super critical of Murdoch and his media empire, and they were big supporters of whistleblowers like Snowden and Assange.
Right, and that really put them on the outs. They got slammed by other media and even the government itself.
And the script goes on to say that eventually the Guardian kind of shifted their focus. They started criticizing those tech platforms more in line with the mainstream media. And they even gave pretty friendly access to people like the heads of MI5 and MI6.
It's a really interesting change, right?
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if they just adapted to survive. or if they got sucked into the very system they used to fight against.
Yeah, the script doesn't give any easy answers, and that's
Yeah,
what makes it so thought-provoking. It really forces you to think critically about power and how it plays out in the real world.
especially in the world of media.
Exactly.
And that brings us to one of the most concerning things about power today: the rise of surveillance capitalism. The script uncovers some pretty disturbing stuff about the deep connections between state power and corporate interests in the digital age, especially when it comes to how the internet developed.
Oh, that's right. It's easy to forget that the Pentagon and those U.S. intelligence agencies, they were heavily involved in the early days of the internet. And Silicon Valley's success, in a lot of ways, was built on research funded by them.
Right.
Like, take Google, for example.
Yeah.
The script mentions that even their founders got funding from a U.S. intelligence initiative,
Yeah.
one that was all about managing huge data systems.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think about that. Things we see as pure commercial innovation actually have roots in government and even military stuff.
Yeah,
And that blurring between government and private companies is just getting worse.
absolutely. And the script emphasizes how all these tangled connections keep shaping the digital world we live in, from the information we see to the choices we make.
It makes you wonder, do you just feel resigned about online privacy at this point? Or is there a point where all this mingling of state and corporate power just becomes unacceptable? We'll get into those questions more in a bit, but first, let's talk about this other aspect of this power dynamic, the revolving door between government, tech platforms, and traditional media outlets. It's crazy.
It really is. It's like they're all playing musical chairs. High-ranking officials going back and forth between government agencies, tech companies, and media outlets.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to keep track. Like the script mentions Michelle Quay, the former Google CTO. She used to work for the Department of Defense and a bunch of intelligence agencies. And then there's Shannon Sullivan. She was in charge of Google's public sector division, and then she went to BAE Systems, one of the biggest weapons manufacturers in the world.
And those are just individual examples. The script also talks about these super exclusive gatherings, like the Highlands Forum and the Sun Valley Conference.
A lot of those things where people from tech, media, and government all hang out together, and who knows what they're cooking up behind closed doors.
It definitely makes you wonder about how these connections, all these behind-the-scenes discussions, how they might be shaping the information we get and the decisions being made at the highest levels.
And it's not always about outright censorship either. The script brings up this really interesting case, Storyful. They kind of play a double role in the media world. They do fact-checking for news organizations, which is important, right? But they also offer reputation management for corporations.
That seems like a pretty clear conflict of interest. How can they be objective journalists while also helping companies control their image?
Exactly. It's like putting the fox in charge of the henhouse. And the script doesn't hold back. It calls this out as the censorship industrial complex, where the government and corporations team up to control information.
It's scary to think about.
For sure.
And the example they give, Facebook censoring the Wuhan lab leak theory because the government asked them to. That's a pretty chilling illustration of how this can play out in real life.
It's a dangerous path, for sure. But now, let's switch gears a bit. The script introduces this idea that, on the surface, seems like it could push back against all this concentrated power: open source journalism. It's like having citizen detectives who use publicly available information and online tools to investigate things like corporate crimes or even war crimes.
Yeah, and the poster child for this is Elliot Higgins, the guy who founded Bellingcat. What's amazing is that he didn't have any formal training as a journalist, but he's become a leading expert in analyzing online information. And he's often way ahead of traditional media and even intelligence agencies in finding out the truth.
Their work is seriously impressive. They've exposed war crimes, identified the people responsible, and challenged official narratives, all using their laptops and the power of the internet. It's pretty inspiring how technology can be used to hold the powerful accountable.
Absolutely. But just like any powerful tool, it can be used for good or bad. And the script raises this big question: just how independent is Bellingcat really? Especially when you consider the backgrounds of their staff, where they get their funding, and some of the groups they work with.
Yeah, some of their people have ties to the national security world, and they've gotten funding from organizations connected to the government. It makes you wonder if they're really objective, or if their investigations are being steered in certain directions.
Right. And the script highlights this one really controversial case. The Pentagon leaker, Jack Teixeira. Remember him? The young airman who leaked those classified documents about U.S. policy in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It was a big deal.
And Bellingcat played a big part in figuring out who he was. They teamed up with the New York Times and used their open source techniques to pinpoint Teixeira as the source of the leaks, which ultimately led to his arrest and a life sentence.
Wow.
That raises some serious ethical questions, don't you think? Is it ever okay for journalists to work with the authorities in a way that could put someone in prison, especially if that person might have been trying to expose wrongdoing?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
Bellingcat supporters say that their expertise and innovative methods are super valuable for holding power accountable, even if it means working with governments sometimes. And they do have a point. They've exposed human rights abuses, war crimes, government lies, often in places where traditional media couldn't or wouldn't go.
Right. But their critics say that this close relationship with the government raises red flags about conflicts of interest and blurry ethical lines. They worry that open source journalism could become a tool of the very powers it's supposed to be watching.
So it's like we're stuck between these two ideas. On one hand, we're celebrating how information is becoming more accessible and how individuals can challenge powerful institutions. But on the other hand, are we accidentally making the surveillance state stronger?
It's a conversation we need to have. And the script, while not giving us easy answers, it gives us the information and the different perspectives we need to really think critically about these complex situations. We can weigh the benefits against the risks and come to our own conclusions.
I like that. Okay, so now the script takes us to another unsettling example of how something that seems well-intentioned can be twisted to serve those in power. The Integrity Initiative. It was this UK government-funded program, and it was supposed to be about fighting disinformation, which sounds good, right?
Yeah, fighting disinformation, who could be against that?
Exactly. But as the script lays out, what was really going on was way more disturbing. The Integrity Initiative was caught doing some pretty shady things, like using social media to attack Jeremy Corbyn, who was the leader of the opposition party at the time.
So basically, it was a government-funded smear campaign disguised as a noble effort to fight fake news.
Exactly. And they were also going after journalists who were critical of the initiative, trying to discredit them and shut them up.
It's a scary reminder that these programs that claim to be defending democracy can easily turn into tools of repression, especially when they operate in secrecy and without accountability. It makes you wonder who gets to decide what disinformation is, and what happens when those in power use these tools to target their opponents.
Those are some really heavy questions. But the point the script is making is that we can't just take these initiatives at face value. We need to be skeptical, ask tough questions, and demand transparency. And the script doesn't stop there. It goes into another case study that shows even more clearly how open source journalism, state power, and media narratives all intertwine. And it brings us back to Elliot Higgins and Bellingcat. Remember how we were talking about their role in identifying that Pentagon leaker, Jack Teixeira?
Yeah.
Well, the script digs deeper into that case, exploring the ethical implications of them working with the New York Times and the government. It's a really complicated situation. You have Bellingcat, known for exposing wrongdoing and challenging powerful institutions, and they're using their expertise to help identify a leaker, someone who, some people might say, was acting in the public interest by revealing classified information.
Yeah, it definitely blurs the lines. On one hand, Bellingcat is using open source techniques to uncover hidden truths, but on the other hand, they're basically helping the government silence a potential whistleblower.
Right, and this case really shows the central tension at the heart of open source journalism. It can be used for good or for bad. It's a tool that can hold power accountable, but it can also be used to reinforce the very power structures it's trying to challenge.
It all boils down to who controls the narrative.
Hmm.
Who gets to decide what information is considered truthworthy
Yeah.
and what gets labeled as disinformation.
And that's where things get really messy. Because as we've been talking about, the lines between state power, corporate interests, and media narratives are becoming more and more blurred.
It's a tangled web, that's for sure. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed, like, it's all rigged, what's the point? But I think that's exactly what those in power want us to think. They want us to feel powerless, to give up on trying to understand and challenge the systems that control our lives.
That's why I think this lecture script is so important. It's not about giving us easy answers or telling us what to believe. It's about giving us the tools and the knowledge to navigate this complex world, to ask critical questions and form our own informed opinions.
And maybe most importantly, it reminds us that we're not alone in this. There are people out there, individuals and organizations, who are dedicated to uncovering the truth, holding power accountable, and fighting for a more just and fair world.
It's like that saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant. The more we shine a light on these shadowy power dynamics, the less power they have.
Exactly. And it all starts with awareness. with recognizing the forces at play, the motivations behind the stories we're being told, and the ways in which power operates, often in very subtle and sneaky ways.
So, what's the takeaway from all of this? What should we be doing?
Well, I think it all comes back to critical thinking. Don't take anything at face value. Question your sources of information. Look for evidence, for corroboration, and most importantly, be willing to challenge the narratives, even the ones that feel comfortable or familiar.
Yeah, it's easy to get trapped in those echo chambers on social media, surrounded by information that just reinforces what we already believe. But we have to step outside of those bubbles, engage with different viewpoints, and be open to changing our minds.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about how power works, the better we can challenge it, hold those in power accountable, and create a world that is more just, fair, and transparent.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a really thought-provoking journey.
It really has. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
And on that note, we'll wrap things up for today. Until next time, stay curious.
It's wild, isn't it?
Totally.
This whole system.
Yeah.
Like, are we seeing genuine cracks, or is it all just a facade?
It's like trying to figure out if a building is actually about to fall apart or if those cracks are just cosmetic, you know? It's all about perspective, right?
Right.
And sometimes I feel like we're so zoomed in on the details, we miss the bigger picture.
That's the challenge the script throws at us. Can we see beyond the surface?
It's like those optical illusions where
Yeah.
you have to kind of like relax your eyes to see the hidden image.
Exactly. You have to shift your perspective to get the full picture.
Okay, so now the script dives into this super fascinating history lesson. It's all about how power dynamics have changed over time, driven by all these technological advances.
It's like every new technology creates a power struggle.
Right. We go from trucking versus airlines, then newspapers battling radio and TV,
Right.
and now it's traditional media versus those tech platforms we were talking about earlier.
And to illustrate this, the script zeroes in on a really captivating case study, the Guardian newspaper, and how their relationship with power has evolved over the years.
Oh, The Guardian. That's a good one.
Right.
So they were known for being fiercely critical of the Murdoch press.
Right, like a thorn in his side.
And they were big champions of whistleblowers like Snowden and Assange.
Oh, yeah. Remember all that controversy?
I do. It was huge.
It really made them a target. They faced so much backlash from other media outlets and even the government.
Yeah, they were definitely swimming against the current.
They
And the script talks about how eventually they shifted their focus. They started joining in with the criticism of tech platforms, aligning more with the mainstream media. And they even started giving more favorable coverage to figures like the heads of MI5 and MI6.
Oh, that's quite a shift. It makes you think, right? Did they make a strategic decision to survive in a changing media landscape?
Right?
Or did they get absorbed into the very power structure they used to challenge?
That's the question, isn't it? And the script doesn't give us an easy answer, which is what makes it so compelling.
It really is. It pushes us to think critically about how power operates in the real world, especially in the media.
Totally.
And speaking of power dynamics in the digital age, this leads us to one of the most concerning aspects of modern power, the rise of what some call surveillance capitalism.
Surveillance capitalism.
Yeah. It's basically the idea that our personal data is being collected and used to manipulate us. And it's all happening under the guise of free services and convenience.
That's unsettling.
It is.
And the script uncovers some pretty alarming revelations about the close ties between state power and corporate interests in the development of the internet.
It's easy to forget that the early internet wasn't just some utopian project. It was heavily influenced by the Pentagon and U.S. intelligence agencies.
I know, it's easy to romanticize the early days of the internet.
Right. But the reality is much more complicated.
Yeah, and Silicon Valley's rise was fueled in part by research funded through those channels.
Exactly. Like take Google, for example. The script mentions that their founders actually received funding from a U.S. intelligence initiative, one that was specifically focused on managing massive data systems.
That's kind of crazy to think about, right?
It is. It shows how what we often perceive as pure commercial innovation is actually deeply intertwined with government and military interests.
Yeah, and that blurring of lines between state and private companies is only becoming more pronounced.
Absolutely. And the script emphasizes how these entanglements continue to shape the digital world we live in, from the information we see to the choices we make. It's all influenced by these powerful forces operating behind the scenes.
It makes you wonder, have we just become numb to the erosion of our online privacy? Or is there a point where this fusion of state and corporate power becomes too much to bear?
Those are important questions.
And speaking of blurring lines, the script also dives into this whole revolving door phenomenon, where high-ranking officials move back and forth between government, tech platforms, and traditional media outlets.
Yeah, it's like they're all part of the same club.
It's almost impossible to keep track of who's who and who's worked where.
It's dizzying.
Like, the script mentions Michelle Quay, the former Google CTO.
Right, her.
She held positions in the Department of Defense and various intelligence agencies before joining Google.
And then you have Shannon Sullivan. She went from heading Google's public sector division to BAE Systems, one of the world's largest arms manufacturers.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild career trajectory.
It is.
And then there are these exclusive gatherings.
Oh, yeah.
Like the Highlands Forum and the Sun Valley Conference.
Those events where figures from tech, media, and government all rub shoulders. And who knows what kind of deals and agendas are being shaped behind those closed doors.
It definitely raises some eyebrows. Like, are these just casual get-togethers, or are they something more?
It's hard to say for sure, but it certainly makes you think about how these connections and backroom discussions might be influencing the information we consume and the decisions being made at the highest levels.
And it's not always about outright censorship either. The script brings up this really interesting example, Storyful. They kind of play this dual role in the media landscape. On one hand, they provide fact-checking services for various news outlets.
Which is important, right, in this age of misinformation.
Absolutely. But on the other hand, they also offer reputation management for corporations.
That seems like a pretty blatant conflict of interest. How can they be objective journalists and also help companies control their image?
Right. It's like, who are they really working for?
Exactly.
And the script calls this out as the censorship industrial complex.
Where state and corporate interests converge to control the flow of information.
It's a scary thought.
It is.
Like, who gets to decide what we see and hear?
Exactly. And they use the example of Facebook censoring the Wuhan lab leak theory at the request of the government. It's a chilling illustration of how this can play out in the real world.
It definitely raises some red flags.
Yeah.
But now, shifting gears a bit, the script introduces this concept that seems like it could be a counterweight to all this concentrated power: open source journalism. It's like having citizen detectives using publicly available information and online tools to investigate everything from corporate malfeasance to war crimes.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing what they've been able to accomplish.
It is.
And the poster child for this movement is Elliot Higgins, the founder of Bellingcat. It's remarkable that he had no formal journalism training.
Really?
Yeah, none. But he's become a leading authority on analyzing online information, often outpacing traditional media and even intelligence agencies in uncovering the truth.
That's impressive. So what kind of stuff have they done?
Well, they've exposed war crimes, identified perpetrators, and challenged official narratives, all using just their laptops and the power of the internet.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like a real-life David versus Goliath story.
It is. But, like any powerful tool, open source journalism can be used for good or for ill.
Right. There's always that potential for misuse.
And the script raises this critical question. How independent is Bellingcat, really? Especially when you consider their staff's backgrounds, their funding sources, and some of their collaborations.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So what's the concern?
Well, some of their contributors have ties to the national security state, and they've received funding from organizations linked to government interests.
That does raise some questions about their objectivity.
Exactly. And the script highlights this one particularly controversial case involving the Pentagon leaker, Jack Teixeira.
Oh, I remember that case. Wasn't he the young airman who leaked those classified documents about U.S. policy in Ukraine? What does Bellingcat have to do with that?
Well, they played a key role in identifying him. They collaborated with the New York Times, using their open source techniques to pinpoint Teixeira as the source of the leaks, which ultimately led to his arrest and life sentence.
Wow, that's heavy.
It is. It raises some serious ethical questions about whether it's ever justified for journalists to collaborate with authorities in a way that could lead to someone's imprisonment, especially when that person might have been motivated by a desire to expose wrongdoing.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's like, where do you draw the line? On one hand, Bellingcat supporters argued that their expertise and innovative techniques are invaluable for holding power accountable, even if it means working with governments on occasion.
And they have a point. Look at their track record. They've exposed human rights abuses, war crimes, government deception, often in places where traditional media couldn't or wouldn't go.
Right, they've done some amazing work.
But on the other hand, The critics argue that this close relationship with government entities raises serious concerns about conflicts of interest, blurring ethical lines, and the potential for open-source journalism to become a tool of the very powers it aims to scrutinize.
So it's like a double-edged sword.
Exactly.
It has the potential to expose the truth and hold the powerful accountable. But it also has the potential to be co-opted and used for less noble purposes.
That's the dilemma.
It's a tough one.
It is.
And it brings us back to that fundamental question. Who controls the narrative?
Who gets to decide what we see and hear, what we believe to be true?
And with all these blurred lines between state power, corporate interests, and media narratives, it's becoming increasingly difficult to know who to trust and what to believe.
It's a challenge, for sure. But that's why it's so important to be aware of these dynamics, to be critical consumers of information,
Absolutely.
and to remember that we have a role to play in shaping the narratives that define our world.
Okay, so the script goes on to explore another example of how seemingly well-intentioned initiatives can be manipulated to serve the interests of those in power. And this one takes us to the UK. Have you heard of the Integrity Initiative?
The Integrity Initiative, yeah, vaguely.
It was this government-funded program that was supposed to be about countering disinformation.
So it's pretty straightforward.
Right, like who could be against that? But as the script reveals, the reality was far more troubling. The Integrity Initiative was exposed for engaging in some pretty shady activities, including using social media to attack Jeremy Corbyn, who was the leader of the opposition party at the time.
Wow, so it was basically a government-funded smear campaign disguised as a noble effort to combat fake news.
Exactly. And they were also targeting journalists who were critical of the initiative, trying to discredit them and silence dissent.
That's messed up. It's a scary reminder that initiatives claiming to defend democracy can easily morph into tools of repression, especially when they operate with little transparency and accountability.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope.
It is. It makes you question, who gets to decide what constitutes disinformation? And what are the potential consequences when those in power use these tools to target their opponents?
Those are important questions, and the script doesn't shy away from them. It challenges us to be skeptical of these initiatives, to ask critical questions, and to demand transparency.
And that's what it all comes down to, right? Being informed, being engaged, and being willing to challenge the narratives that are being presented to us.
Absolutely.
And on that note, let's dive into another case study that further illustrates the complex interplay between open source journalism, state power, and media narratives.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
This one brings us back to Elliot Higgins and Bellingcat. Remember how we were talking about their role in identifying the Pentagon leaker, Jack Teixeira?
Yeah, that was a wild one.
Well, the script examines this case in more detail, exploring the ethical implications of their collaboration with the New York Times and the government.
So it's like a deep dive into a deep dive. I'm ready. Let's do it. It's a tricky one, right? You have Bellingcat. They're known for exposing wrongdoing, challenging these powerful institutions, and then they use their expertise to help identify a leaker, someone who some might say was acting in the public interest by revealing this classified information.
Yeah, it definitely makes things murky.
It does.
On the one hand, you have Bellingcat using these open source techniques to dig up the truth, but on the other, they're basically assisting the government in silencing a potential whistleblower.
It's like a catch-22 almost. And this whole case really highlights the central tension with open source journalism, its potential for both good and bad. It can be used to hold those in power accountable, but it can also be used to reinforce the very power structures it's supposed to be challenging.
It really boils down to this question. Who gets to control the narrative? Who decides what information gets labeled as truth and what gets dismissed as disinformation?
Yeah, and as we've been talking about, the lines between state power, corporate interests, and media narratives are getting blurrer and blurrer.
It's like trying to untangle a giant knot.
It really is.
And it can be so easy to feel overwhelmed. Like, what's the point? It's all rigged anyway.
Right.
But I think that's exactly what those in power want us to feel. Powerless. Like we should just give up on trying to understand and challenge these systems that control our lives.
That's why I find this lecture script so important. It's not about giving us simple answers or telling us what to think. It's about giving us the tools and knowledge we need to navigate this crazy world, to ask critical questions and come to our own conclusions.
And what I find most important, and reminds us, we're not alone in this. There are people out there, individuals and organizations, who are dedicated to finding the truth, holding the powerful accountable, and fighting for a more just and equitable world.
Yeah, that gives me some hope. It's like that saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant. The more we expose these power dynamics, the less effective they become.
Exactly. It all begins with awareness. Recognizing the forces at play, understanding the motivations behind the stories we're being fed, and seeing how power operates, often in very subtle and sneaky ways.
So, if we had to sum it all up, what would be the main takeaway here? What should our listeners be doing?
Well, I think it all circles back to critical thinking. Don't accept things at face value. Question your sources, look for evidence for confirmation, and maybe most importantly, be ready to challenge those narratives, even the ones that seem the most comfortable or familiar.
It's so easy to get sucked into those echo chambers online, surrounded by information that just reinforces our
It's
biases. But we've got to break out of those bubbles, engage with different perspectives, and be willing to change our minds.
right. And never forget, knowledge is power. The more we understand about how power works, the better equipped we are to challenge it, hold those in power accountable, and create a world that's more just, fair, and transparent.
That's a great message to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a truly thought-provoking conversation.
It really has. And remember, this is just the beginning. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
And on that note, we'll wrap things up for today. Until next time, stay curious.